the first case you ever won as an attorney, you were defending a double homicide.
Double attempted homicide. Yeah.
Double attempted homicide.
Yeah.
And you were only 23 years old.
Correct. Yeah.
Tell me about that experience.
It was probably something that I would recommend no one ever do. Myself and my partner had just gone out on our own. We had both worked for firms and thought, why not take the leap, hang up a shingle of our own and that sort of thing. And one of the first cases that came along, we did a lot of smaller stuff, traffic court, landlord-tenant disputes, that sort of thing. And we sort of took anything that came in the door because we needed to survive. But he had an acquaintance through his church whose husband had been arrested. And then as the story came through, it was a double attempted homicide, and he was charged with stabbing two roommates. The friend of my partner's was like a domestic help worker for a woman who she lived with. So, like, she lived in there. So her husband had a separate apartment during the week, but he was like their gardener over the weekends. So he had these two roommates, and they got into a fight or dispute one day. We're talking about 1992, something like that, and was arrested and charged with attempted murder. It was stabbings. So yeah, that was the first case. And again, in hindsight, we were biting off way more than we should have, really. I say that cautiously because we won. Mm-hmm. At the same time, young lawyers who don't have that much trial experience don't be needing to risk someone's life, for the rest, conceivably 25 to life at the time in New York.
Their freedoms.
Twice. So, but we just thought we had a really good case. It was a self-defense case. And, we were very lucky. I've always been good at reaching out to more experienced mentors, And I was fortunate enough to have had one built in. My dad, growing up was like, quite a wise guy, not wise guy, but wise person.
Gentleman, yeah.
Yeah. And, he was always encouraging us as kids to sort of seek out people who could teach us things that we didn't know, and he didn't know, so that came up a lot in our childhood. He wasn't proprietary about like, I'm your dad and you can learn everything from me, that sort of thing. He's like, he was from another country. He's from Guyana, and there's no baseball in Guyana, and I wanted to play baseball. So he's like, well, let's go find you a good team and a good coach because I don't know anything about baseball.
Yeah, he's open-minded.
Yeah, so that has sort of had always been our like way of being, and it was never anything that was like, weird to like reach out to people and say, hey, can you help me with this? Or can you explain this to me? I don't know how to do this. My partner and I had moved into a suite of attorneys' offices where there were like three very experienced trial lawyers. And one of whom kind of took me under his wing. He had formerly been the chief of the trial bureau for Queens County DA's office. And, he kind of like walked me through how you do this, right? Like everything, like where do I stand when I'm addressing the jury, that sort of thing, And, my partner and I had both had decent amount of experience in public speaking and that sort of thing. So it wasn't like super nerve wracking. But so we prepared as best as we could. And I think that a lot of the reason, if I'm being generous, but like we took that case was because these people had so little money, and they would have been having to sort of appeal to legal aid or a public defender at that time, and they wanted to know like if there anybody could help them, and I think they had a meeting, and public defenders, at the time, and I'm sure still are, really overwhelmed, don't have the amount of time that they really want to have to dedicate to cases. So I think, they were reaching out for help, having probably spoken to public defender's office and thought, I don't think they're going to give us the time we need on this. Then again, it's a catch-22. They don't have the money. So we took it largely on that basis. Like, we'll take it for whatever you can afford. And,
Incredible.
Yeah. So that's what we did. And, it was a pretty interesting case for a first trial. Again, in hindsight, I'm more nervous probably now. Like,
really?
Holy crap. I can't believe we did that,
Yeah. So,
this guy, but he was acquitted on all counts, and, he went home after, he never had money to make bail. So he'd been in for a year and a half.
Wow.
No prior record. Right. So like, the jury went out to deliberate. They stayed in overnight, which, the court officers told us, oh, that's a good sign. Like, you gave them something to think about, that they went in overnight. At least somebody's on your side, and then they came in the next morning, probably deliberated for a few more hours, and then acquitted of all counts. So then we thought we were good lawyers,
rightfully so,
and we just started taking, and then the little reputation grows, like, because the other lawyers in the office said, those kids won that case, like, and then they started giving us cases that would come in that either, they got someone who came in and that person had a co-defendant, and they said, oh, these guys in my office, they can take the co-defendant. And so we got right in and like sort of like under the wing of some very, very experienced trial attorneys right from the beginning, and just like learned from them, followed along, and, probably took on a lot more cases than most people do, trial cases at that stage in their career. So
mentorship has been
huge,
pivotal.
Yeah.
Right? Huge.
Everything. Yeah.
So I was curious, walk me through the mindset you have to take on such a serious case, especially, we'll talk about your college experience, but you started doing this at such a young age.
Yeah.
Describe how your mindset's changed. What kind of mindset do you have to represent someone accused of this type of crime?
I think that with anything challenging in life, that you have to walk that line between confidence and overconfidence, and it probably doesn't look this way from, my resume, but I sort of, if I'm being honest, I lack confidence in almost everything, right? So that is the sort of motivating force behind over-preparing, right? And I say over-preparing is probably just enough, but like, if you think you're prepared for something, prepare more, and when the stakes are especially high, you really don't want to like have a bad result, whatever it is. Could be, a bad verdict, a bad meet, whatever it is. And then sort of like lay awake thinking, I should have done this, I should have done that. You try to anticipate whatever it is. So yeah, I mean, I would say being confident but not overconfident in preparation. Those are all kind of go hand in hand. If you're not confident to a certain extent, things rarely will go the way you want them to.
Yeah, I think you have to be competent.
Sure. Yeah,
which is key.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, it's this sort of like this Dunning-Kruger sort of analysis.
Yep.
And the idea that like, I mean, it boils down to being too stupid to know you're stupid, right?
Mountain stupid.
Yeah.
That's what they call it, right?
Yeah. And like, how can you know that which you do not know? But it sort of washes out in like overconfidence, right? Like people who know very little about something are sure they know the answer. Mm-hmm. Whereas people who are experts are aware of all the potential variables that might affect the outcome and are therefore much less confident than someone who knows nothing, right?
Exactly.
And this shows up in like everything from professional life, athletics, politics, certainly, but like this idea that in kind of the inverse of that, I think is what they call imposter syndrome, which I think I coach a lot of women, and it shows up a lot more in women over the years. I think that like they really are very good at what they do, but they are not as confident as you would think based on their qualifications and their experience.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
Whereas the flip side of that is Dunning-Kruger people are like supremely overconfident, so yeah, it is a balance to know. And like, how can you understand calculus if you've never heard of trigonometry or algebra, but
yeah, it's true.
And those things might as well not exist.
Yeah.
So
walk me through the mindset when you meet a client for the first time for representing them. Walk me through, I don't want to put anything in your mouth, of the mindset of are there expectations? Walk me through that,
So, I think that it's a tricky skill set that you need to have, initially when you're sort of interviewing a client. Like, they're interviewing you and you're interviewing them. A lot of my practice in New York, I did 20 years as they call an 18B lawyer, which is a lawyer assigned to handle, if you're on the felony panel, which I was, you're certified and assigned to handle major felonies for people who can't afford lawyers. And even though we were private attorneys, about half that work went to the legal aid, public offenders. And then the other half at the time, I think there's some other agencies involved now, but at the time, a good chunk of that work went to private attorneys who had like a negotiated rate with the city, and the city would pay you for representing indigent defendants that legal aid either, could not represent or weren't able to represent for whatever reason. And so sometimes they were just stuck with you, and
so you didn't have a choice.
Yeah. Like, they would present either frequently when they're indigent and the crimes are serious, they're locked up pending the trial because they can't make bail because they're indigent. Right. Mm-hmm. And the crime is serious enough that bail is set high or there's no bail. So they're frequently aren't like, for us, they were in Rikers Island all the time. So you would go to Rikers Island and you would wait a couple hours for them to find your guy and bring him to the little attorney conference room. And you would introduce yourself, I'm your lawyer, like it or not, kind of thing. And, they always had the option of telling a judge, I don't like this lawyer, and the judge can decide I'll give you another one or I won't, I kind of ended up for a little while as like the backstop because, clients and lawyers wouldn't get along, and then they'd finally bring me in and like, this is your last shot, because I didn't really give much back, like I tried to represent everybody I could,
sure,
whether they didn't like me or not, or liked me or not. And, you just try to find a way to explain what I'm doing, and why indigent defendants that haven't paid you themselves are inherently skeptical. Who do you really work for? Yeah. If the city's paying you, then aren't you really working for them? If the same people that are paying you are paying the prosecutor, like, I'm going to get screwed, aren't I? That kind of thing. And, trying to convince them of that, look, my ethical obligation is to protect you. It doesn't matter who's paying me, So there wasn't so much of an analysis in those situations of like, do we like each other? We're kind of like, okay, we're stuck with each other. When you have private clients that come in, frequently it's a question of figuring out like, what are their expectations, and then trying to see if those expectations are appropriate based on the information that you then have, and managing those expectations and trying to give your best advice as to potential likely outcomes. It's a terrible idea to tell people that, I'm sure this will happen. based on the very little information you have when you first interview someone, you know?
Sure.
But then you also don't want to come across as too wishy-washy, because then they'll be like, well, you know,
They lack confidence in you.
They lack confidence in you. Exactly.
Yeah.
So, you know, a lot of it has to do with sort of like reading the person that you're talking to and figuring out what their expectations are, what you can do for them, you know.
Tell me a little bit about like the method you would have when you're getting to know a client with questioning and interpretation.
I don't know that there was a specific method. I usually assume that everyone I'm speaking to is telling the truth, right? And, you know, I was sort of like chuckle when people ask like, oh, you know, you were a trial lawyer for all those years. How do you know when someone was lying? I'm like, I don't know. You know, like I watch these television shows. Like we love watching like, you know, crime procedurals, myself and Molly, my wife, and she'll pause it and be like, does that make any sense to you? And I'm like, no, you know, like,
Yeah.
Yep. And, you know, I don't know how these people, like, you know, you can tell by his body language or his eyes, you know, she's definitely lying because of this. It's like, I don't know, you know, people who act sort of flighty and nervous in interviews or on the witness stand might be flighty and nervous because they're nervous, you know,
Sure.
And they're in front of a jury and the stakes are high, whether they're themselves being accused of something or they're a witness of something and they appreciate the significance of it, you know. Being like shifty and moving, tell me anything. They could be 100% telling the truth as they understand it, you know. So I just generally assume people are telling the truth, you know, and I don't know if that's a character flaw, but I feel like it has gotten me into some like awkward situations, certainly in like social and personal situations where I just assume people are telling me the truth when they're talking to me. And then I find out that perhaps it's not quite that clear. And then I'm always surprised, but I still always assume the next person is telling the truth.
I think it's a safe bet because if you're doing the opposite, you'll never trust anyone.
Precisely.
So you're better off being optimistic, especially if you're representing people, right?
Yeah, I read a book of speeches many years ago that Martin Luther King had written. And he talked about people can only become trustworthy if you first trust them. Which is kind of exactly what you just said. You know, like you don't. So we'll assume that you are, you know, honest and that your intentions are good, you know, and you're not trying to deceive me or anybody else. And you're giving me the whole truth, you know, with also the understanding that people could honestly believe they're telling the truth. I used to say, like, people can pass a lie detector and be completely wrong, you know, it's just the truth as they perceive it, you know, and we would see that a lot in like eyewitness accounts of an event. You know, you get 6 witnesses to an event, which is typically a mistake. If the prosecution does that, they bring in 6 witnesses because they're all going to tell different stories. And I'll just, it doesn't matter what happened. I'll just tell the jury, look, none of them are telling the same story. So clearly we can't rely on the eyewitness accounts, right?
Yeah.
And you know, you'll sort of zoom in on those details, but people honestly believe things that aren't true. Like their just memory was faulty, or they misremembered it, or something else. They're mixing one memory with another. It doesn't mean they're lying. It's not true. But at least when I'm talking to people initially, I assume that what they're telling me is their best recollection, and you know, and they're being honest about it, and then kind of work from there.
There's also optical illusions where they've proven they'll show you squares and it looks like the paper is fading.
Yeah.
And then they take the 2 squares on opposite sides and they prove they're actually the same color.
Sure.
But our brain interprets it differently.
Yeah.
So that just happens in everyday life.
Yeah. All
Was
the
the
time.
can holding alcoholic?
Yeah.
These cans are definitely not alcohol, but
Right.
they could look like that.
Sure.
From a lot of, you know,
yeah, and people's experiences and like their, you know, biases. Yeah. Well, that's, you know, something that came up years ago, and I don't actively try cases anymore. I'm more of a sort of like support and consulting role, but for years people were relying on like identification. I say people, convictions were based on identification testimony. And then sort of a series of studies came out showing that which we probably already knew to be true, which was like cross-racial identifications are very rarely accurate.
You see what you want to see,
yeah,
whether it's good or bad.
Right.
Yeah.
So, people of one ethnicity describing people of another ethnicity or mistaking one person of an ethnicity for someone of the same ethnicity was much more common than people of the same ethnicity identifying someone. So like if someone had the same background as someone that they were identifying, they're more likely to be accurate. If it's someone of a different race or ethnicity, they're much less likely to be accurate, but there was all kinds of convictions based on eyewitness testimony that turned out couldn't possibly be that person. And the DNA evidence was good for that because, it showed that
Definitely.
This guy absolutely could not be, I don't know who did it, but he didn't, know, but he was convicted by a jury,
Wow.
And there were like, hundreds of people were on death row at one time who had been convicted by eyewitness testimony that turned out to be, not possible, impossible, So, people are telling the truth as they see it, I'm sure. But, I remember a judge gave me advice in one of my first trials. And I think there were a lot of people, looking back, I was physically big, like I was always
jacked.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, even in my early 20s, I was a competitive athlete. So that kind of threw off my age a little bit. But like, if you looked at me in the face carefully, you'd realize this is a young kid. Do you know what I mean?
I was going to ask you, you're interviewing people, odds are typically older than you in the beginning of your career.
Yeah.
Right? And the judges had been older than you.
Right.
There's no 23-year-old judge.
Right.
How did these people perceive you? So you started to describe, physically it helped. You looked more mature. But did they not take you seriously?
No, they did. What I would get a lot was people wanting to like help me out, in the sense of, occasionally I ran into judges who would like poke me a little bit to make sure, like, are you sure you know what you're doing here? Because, so again, I learned to over prepare.
Sure.
So, and then when they were satisfied that like I wasn't in the wrong building, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah. I would be.
Yeah. Then they're like, okay, let's move forward.
Yeah, they trust
but occasionally, like I had one judge who took a very like grandmotherly approach to me. She was a state Supreme Court trial judge. And, I think she was in her early 70s at that time. And, I know she just saw me as a child, and I had some heavy cases in front of her, like people facing, years in prison for fairly heavy cases. And, we had a sidebar conference once and she was saying how, I think it's better to tell the jury that someone is mistaken. And she was referring to police officers rather than that they're lying. And I was like, yeah, I was planning on doing it that way, but okay. You know what I mean? Like, it's a lot more palatable for people to understand. Like everybody makes mistakes. I'm not going to assert that you're deliberately lying. It's a lot easier for people to say, okay, yeah, that person made a mistake. I don't have to say that they're a liar in order to come to a decision, you know, but it's easier to say, oh yeah, like they make a mistake. And it's something that you should cover if you're picking a jury on what they call voir dire, which is like the examination of potential jurors before you seat them. You have a pool of jury members come in, potential jurors. And then in New York, it was 12-person juries. I know in Florida, it's 6. And then you pick usually 2 alternates. And so you've got to pick 14 people. You've got a certain amount of challenges you can make. Some are called peremptory challenges where you don't really have to explain yourself. And some are challenges for cause where like you can tell the judge, I want this person excused because of the following reason or something that they said or whatever. But picking people who are predisposed to accepting the possibility that someone can make an honest mistake is very helpful, right?
Yeah.
Like, so, I like jurors that were open-minded, obviously, and open to the possibility that people can make mistakes. I don't have to necessarily mean that they're lying in order to make you decide one way or another. That's sort of the way I've sort of like functioned in my general life, is like I'll assume you're being genuine until something tells me you're not being genuine.
I feel it's a very wise a wise approach. Because if you're just soured and you look at everything
Yeah.
as just terrible, how often are you going to be pleasantly surprised,
Right.
rather than unfortunately disappointed?
Disappointed. Yeah,
Right.
of course. Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. I think, it's all, it can be hard. Like if you get burnt in some way, whether it's in a personal relationship or a friendship, a group, a work environment. And then, a typical response is, well, I'm never letting that happen to me again,
Good luck.
Yeah. It's like, it's not up to you,
Yeah.
I mean, if it keeps happening, it may be you, right?
Sure.
Like,
You're the magnet.
Like you may have to look in the mirror at a certain point. So like, this keeps happening. Okay. Well, there's a commonality here that maybe you're not considering. Right. But every relationship is unique. Every group of people is unique. You have a group of 10 people and replace one of them, the whole group changes, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's impossible to predict behavior to any real degree of certainty based on what happened to you in the past. I mean, aside from the obvious,
Sure.
But yeah, so I try to take that approach, like, assume everyone is decent and well-meaning.
What cases were the most difficult for you as a person, whether it's ethically, morally?
I don't, I was pretty good at separating myself from the emotional aspects of a case, and I did believe, and I do believe, that everyone is entitled to the best defense they can get if they're accused of a crime. If you are the plaintiff in a contract dispute, you should do your best for the person who's saying, I got ripped off. If you're the lawyer on the other side and the person is saying, I did not rip them off, do your best for that person. I've had clients accused of very heinous things. And you have to sort of separate yourself out and say, look, this person is telling me that they didn't do it, right? I'm not allowed to suborn perjury. So if I start to understand that they did in fact do things that they've lied to me about, right? Then, there's some ways to avoid involving yourself in that without compromising the client
Case.
and the case. But even with, sort of horrific circumstances, you try to take sort of a more detached approach, and say, okay, well, I'm not necessarily defending this person's behavior or what they did. I'm defending the system of justice that says, if you can prove the case against this person, prove the case against this person. And I'll hold you to your responsibility as the government to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt. If you do, and I've done my best, that's what happened.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes I had clients who understood that, sometimes they didn't. The difficulty sometimes was in people who were suffering under some form of delusion. And certainly the criminal justice system is not good at treating people. It's not, I don't think it's supposed to be, really. Unfortunately, sometimes it's like the last stop. on people's journey of, mental illness or whatever it is. It's like, oh, we're just going to lock you away, and that was sometimes difficult. I had a case, I had several, but this one stuck out. I had a client who was accused of attempted murder of his own mother. And he was arrested because the neighbors started smelling foul odor coming from his apartment where he lived with his mother. And so they called the police, and it was like a pretty foul odor. And when, they had to break the door down, and he was in there like watching TV, and his mom was on the floor in a pile of her own waste, alive, but with like a broken leg and, fractured orbital bone, all this kind of stuff. Like he beat her up very badly, and was like just watching TV, and had been like going in and out to get beer and whatever for a few days. And the neighbors were like, something's wrong. We haven't seen her in a long time. And, it was like an apartment building. And when I met him in court, like for the arraignment, he was like, not to be facetious, but his eyes were spinning in his head. Do you know what I mean? And
sure,
like completely disheveled, unkempt, hadn't been able to take care of himself at all, alcohol, that sort of thing. And just like, he just looked like, your stereotypical homeless bum kind of thing.
Very evident something was wrong.
Something was wrong. With his speech, his behavior, he was prone to outbursts and that kind of thing. So I requested that he be evaluated from a psych perspective. And if the judge grants that, they go to like a psychiatric hospital for evaluation. The case is put on hold for however long you think it's going to take. And then the person is brought, this is in New York. I'm not sure exactly what this sort of procedure is in every state, but I'm sure it's fairly similar. And then the person is brought back to court with a report from whichever doctor or doctors interviewed them. And then what do they say? And, it's a tricky thing because, you also have to bear in mind that your client may not want you to assert that he's crazy or she's crazy, quote unquote crazy, right? And that, you doing that, you have to make sure that's in their best interest and you can defend why you did that, right? Yeah. Because some people don't want a diagnosis of schizophrenia on their record, when, they think you're, look at like,
they'd rather not know.
Yeah. Or you're out to get me like everybody else is. And you just want to lock me away and this kind of thing. And, it's a tricky one. But in like cases that seem quite obvious, it's sometimes in their best interest. So this particular person, when he came back, it was like 5 weeks later, after being sent to a psychiatric hospital for evaluation. They had diagnosed him with a serious and chronic mental illness and had begun medicating him. I didn't recognize him when he came back to court, right?
Wow.
Haircut, hair combed, clean shaven, very presentable.
Sharper mindset.
Yeah. And just all of a sudden, a decent guy, mortified by what he was charged with, right? Like,
very sad.
Just horrified at what he was charged with. And he's like, whatever happens to me, I deserve it, that sort of thing. You know what I mean? And this is not the same guy. Like, when they brought him out for me to see him in the back before you come out into the courtroom, I'm like, this is not my guy. Like I need this guy, not this guy.
How do you defend that?
So again, staying away from the legal technicalities for a minute, but just like the emotional and moral implications of that person not being in many ways the same person who did this heinous thing.
Exactly.
But we're going to punish this person for what that person did, right? And there's long conversations to be had about like to what extent do we forgive and move on, and like what are the theories behind punishment and why do we punish in the first place and that sort of thing, and what do we hope to accomplish? And I think it varies. I don't have strong feelings on all those things for every person at all times. I think it depends, right? But it was interesting, to see like, okay, well, there is a problem here in that like clearly you need to be medicated and you weren't when you assaulted your mother, right? And you were self-medicating with alcohol, right? Which didn't help. So even if there was some way of getting outpatient treatment, can you be trusted to stay on your meds and, not do this again, sort of thing? And but does this person who is now aware of himself and surroundings and is actually a decent person, does he need to spend years staring out bars of, like of a prison cell? Like, because the person who did that is not the same person in many ways, right?
Yeah.
So, and I think in that case, what ultimately happened, it had a lot to do with like his mother's capacity for forgiveness and understanding. And, he needed inpatient treatment, and we came to an agreement where like long-term inpatient treatment where he could still see her and that sort of thing, but stay on his meds and stuff. But, the caseload was overwhelming for us. I didn't like keep in touch with him afterwards, but like you try to get a good resolution and move on. But yeah, no, I found that one particularly interesting. Like he had done something terrible, clearly, but I don't know what we do about it. And this business of like the finding that he had a chronic and serious mental illness. I've had reports come back from a court, a decision from a court based on my submissions, the prosecution submissions, and the evaluation of the mental health professionals. And the judge absorbs all those and says, it is clear that the person has a chronic and serious mental illness. However, they are fit for trial, because the bar is so low, like, do you know your name? Do you know what this building is? You're fit for trial,
Yeah.
And that's how it was then. I don't know that it's changed much for the better now. Nor am I sure that it should. You have to have at some point a rule, right?
Yeah.
And that's it. And if you're one of the people that gets caught on the wrong side of that unfairly, I mean, those are the breaks. I don't know what to
Same
say.
thing in medicine.
Yeah.
So, as a firefighter,
Yeah.
we have to deem you of sane mind and body if you were to decline what we're here to help you with, right?
Yeah.
So we got to prove it a couple ways. What's your name? Who's the U.S. president? Who's the current president?
Right.
What day of the week is it?
Right.
A bunch of questions you can ask. What color is this?
Sure.
And if they decline, we prove they're of sane, enabled mind and body.
Yeah.
You can't force them, right?
Yeah.
I've been asked the question, what were the most difficult cases or for me, patients or calls I had as a fireman?
Yeah.
And the way I've described it, you don't get to choose which ones affect you.
Yeah.
Where I ran hundreds of calls.
Right.
A lot of them really sad. It might not be sad call number 1 or number 12, but for some reason, number 14 or 37 hits you.
Yeah.
38 might not, but for whatever reason.
Yeah.
And I'm always curious how people, how they react and how it may change their mindset. So I didn't know that from a lawyer's perspective.
I think it's probably very similar, and also factor in like your own frame of mind when you go to call 37.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? It might have been different than when you go to call 38.
Sleep deprived.
Yeah, whatever it is. Just had an argument with a friend or whatever, that colors like how you perceive and remember that experience, And I mean, the stories are like there's a multitude.
They're endless.
Yeah, they're endless. Right. And there's so many, and occasionally they come up, as relevant anecdotes. But you try to, and they say like, what can you learn from? Ultimately, you learn that you have to try your best. That's it.
Yeah, I hear that often.
Yeah,
because you can provide 100% perfect care. And the person doesn't make it.
Yeah.
Right.
You just try
or they lose the limb or so on and so forth. Or you could be like, wow, I made so many mistakes. I can't believe they're okay.
Yeah.
Right. And you just have to kind of learn to live with the reality. Right.
Yeah.
The tougher one is I did everything perfect and the outcome wasn't desirable.
Yeah.
Right. You described yourself as the backstop. a little bit ago.
Yeah.
Oftentimes, and kind of last resort.
Yeah.
Were there ever times that you declined a client? Were you allowed to do that?
It depends. Sometimes, you were really not allowed to do that. Like the judge would say, I'm assigning to this case. You're on the 18B panel. You're up and figure it out, because they just didn't want to go through this 3 or 4 more times.
Because you're on that panel.
Yeah.
As a private attorney.
Oh, a private attorney, I could,
decline anyone.
I couldn't say that, my client and I have, the equivalent of, irreconcilable differences, and I can no longer represent them, or he doesn't want me to be his lawyer anymore. And you would ask for time for them to get a new lawyer and that sort of thing. And typically the court wouldn't get too much into the details. They didn't like to hear that, well, I don't want to represent him anymore because I didn't get paid yet, or that sort of thing.
Sure.
They're like, well, that's your problem. But then again, your client didn't want you having their future in your hands if you were annoyed at them for not being paid, so sometimes it was better to just say, I think, this person should try to get a legal aid attorney or assign an 18B attorney. Sometimes I had a case as a private case where I said, Judge, I initially took the case with the understanding that I was going to get paid this much money. And then, he doesn't have that money. But would the court consider assigning him an 18B attorney? So you can get a different private attorney, but the city will pay for it, that sort of thing. And that would happen occasionally, I didn't ask to be appointed as 18B counsel to clients I had previously taken as private clients, because I felt there was ethical, consequences.
Very wise thing.
Yeah. So that was sort of frowned upon, is take a case, take a few dollars, and then ask the court to finish paying you,
Sure.
You should go get somebody else, kind of thing.
Definitely.
Yeah.
What inspired you to be a criminal defense attorney?
I thought about that for a while. I don't really know,
There's a lot of law.
Yeah.
And it could have been real estate, could have been intellectual property that you're defending, but criminal defense is very, very tough.
Yeah. I just felt like, maybe that's the reason.
The challenge.
Yeah. So something that I've come to be aware of about myself is that the way I handle things that I don't like is I get as good as I can at those things, right? So I don't really like confrontation, so I became a trial attorney, right? You know what I mean?
Wow. Okay.
And
Yep.
I don't like violence as a child growing up. I didn't like it. Didn't like being around it. So I studied martial arts for 15 years, so because I was afraid of it, I was like, well, I better get good at it, and that applies to a lot of things. That for firearms, things that I was afraid of, well, I better learn as much as I can.
Sure.
Because these things scare me.
Education.
Yeah.
Is really what you're describing, right?
I guess so. Yeah. But you can shy away from things you don't have to do.
Sure.
Right. So there's plenty of lawyers who don't try cases because they don't want to. And they might be fantastic lawyers at whatever else it is that they do, whether it's conveyancing or, deeds or trusts or wills and estates and really important stuff, but they just don't really have an interest in going to court, and I think that's probably the bulk of the profession, worldwide, doesn't really go to court, just, help people manage their affairs another way. But because I was always reluctant when it came to confrontation. And so it's well, I better figure out as much as I can about this, It helped me approach it in a mechanical way, sort of, and that's the way I approach most of the things that, I do, is try to make them as sort of technical and mechanical as possible, rather than just go with the flow or see what happens or rely on some sort of talent that you think you have that you really don't,
Sure.
Yeah. So, but yeah, I think it was the most distilled version of the adversarial system. So I figured, well, I'll just jump into that then, because,
pretty bold.
I guess. I mean, so I was young, and sometimes things you just keep going because that's what you're doing, and, I was heavily influenced by my father, who passed 2 years and a bit ago. And he always had a respect for trial lawyers. He was an accountant himself, but he would tell stories about, this trial lawyer and what he did in this case. And I watched this cross-examination one time. I was like, oh, that sounds really great.
It
like,
molds you.
yeah, that sort of matching wits,
Yeah.
with people who are, equally qualified, sometimes better qualified, equally smart, sometimes smarter than you. And you just try your best, why do we do anything, right? Why did I become a powerlifter? Why do I coach? You don't have to. It's painful and it's hard and it requires discipline and time and it can be all encompassing. So why do we do it? We just do it,
Very true.
uh,
Tell me about the International Baccalaureate program. Describe what it is and how it allowed you to pursue law school at such an early age.
Yeah, so I went to the United Nations International School for what would be considered high school in Manhattan, and Florida has several schools that teach the full IB. The International Baccalaureate is I guess the closest equivalent would be like in England, they have the O levels and A levels, which are entrance to university and professional studies. The International Baccalaureate is considered, certainly at the time, I'm not really sure what it is now, but to be like a higher standard of, exams and qualifications. And you have at the time, you had 3 IB higher, IBH courses you had to take, and you could pick which ones, and then 3 IBH lower, you could pick which ones. You could do IBH math, and then IBS or whatever it was called.
There are levels to it.
Yeah, levels to it. Spanish, and you would kind of put together a curriculum, and it would have to be approved. And if you successfully completed all these things to the satisfaction of the IB examiners, you would get an International Baccalaureate diploma, which I think broadly, maybe it's the level somewhere between an associate's and a bachelor's, maybe a bachelor's for some people.
Yeah.
And I know that in many countries, having a full IB certificate allows you to pursue professional studies directly. So if you wanted to be a doctor or a lawyer, or you don't have to do an additional 4 years of schooling just to start law school, right? So the idea was that you had accomplished most of that by the time you graduated with the IB certificate. So that's what I did. And I went to law school in England, and even then I was young. I had the full IB. Most of my classmates were people who had done their A levels and got good marks in England. I think I might have been the only IB student in my year. And I was 17, so I was very young, and again, because I was physically big, in terms of probably overly muscularly developed for the time to be 17. I've been lifting weights since I was 14 years old, and had already started, in powerlifting, and it didn't look like I was a child, that shouldn't be there.
Sure.
So a lot of people were a bit surprised to find out how old I was. Even in England, there are people tend to be a little bit younger when they start professional studies. But yeah, so I did a 3-year law degree in England, and then I was 20, and then I did the British Bar, which is a year at the Inns of Court School of Law in London. You have to be sponsored by one of the 4 Inns of Court. There's Lincoln's Inn, Gray's Inn, Middle Temple, and Inner Temple. And if you apply and are admitted into one of those temples, or inns, they call them, they'll sponsor you to take the bar exam, and you can use their facilities while you're studying. Each inn has its own like dining facilities and a library, and its own sort of like patrons and that sort of thing. And then at the end of the course year, there's the bar exam and if you pass that and you're admitted, you're a British barrister, right? And then if you're a British barrister, then many jurisdictions around the world will allow you either to practice law there because it's considered sort of like the core standard, right? The English legal system, like our American laws, with the exception, I think, of like Louisiana, which has a lot of like French codification in their law. American states are heavily based on the English legal system, right? And Australia, half of Asia, New Zealand, Canada, have this sort of like adversarial English legal system. So like if you're a British barrister, it's considered a fairly recognized qualification. So in New York, I had to take the New York bar, but they allowed me to take the New York bar because I was a British barrister. So then I came back, took the New York bar, and then, at 21, so like I think I got my results when I was 22, so I was a British barrister and a New York attorney and admitted federally to, the different courts in New York districts by the time I was 22. Yeah. In fact, I had a law degree before I could drink in the United States,
Unbelievable. And you're so modest.
No, I mean, when you're young and like, you think, you're bright enough, like you take tests and you do okay, and typically did better if I applied myself, but I was just as lazy as everybody else, I'd rather play with my friends or, draw superheroes or whatever it was, eventually at some point people think, oh, okay, well, this kid is bright, and then when I started the IB, I was like, oh, everybody's bright,
Yeah.
And I'm not, like, relative to my friends, I'm average, right? And then when I went to law school, I'm like, holy crap, these kids are geniuses. And like, when I first got thrown into like workshops and studies and, case analysis and stuff, and I would listen to what the students were saying around me, I'm like, holy shit, she knows everything about this, and I don't know what she's talking about, So like, it was just, it certainly never had a sense of, oh, this is impressive. I always had a sense of like, I'm just hanging on, and I hope nobody finds out that I don't know what I'm doing. You know what I mean?
Trying your best.
Just try your best,
So the IB program is still extremely rigorous, very exceptional. What was the hardest part of that program for you?
In hindsight, I would say organizing your time, because you're a child, you're a teenager, and you're given, advanced level work to do. Your professors or teachers have, 40 other people they're responsible for. And if you don't do your work, that's your problem, so sort of like there wasn't a lot of hand-holding by faculty and administration at that level. They're like, well, if you don't want to do this, you don't have to, just get a regular high school diploma, so the pressure came from like your family and to do well. But even so, my parents kind of stayed out of my way as long as I was passing, like the brakes would come on pretty hard if I screwed up, like,
Sure.
Okay, no more of this, or this until these grades come out, but I think, being able to organize your own time at a time when you don't have any understanding of what that means, And, like meeting your friends, is so much more important than getting that paper in on time and then still having to get that paper in on time.
Yeah.
So
the life experience. You just didn't have much.
Don't have it. Yeah.
Yeah.
You can be bright, but like, you don't know anything,
Yeah.
and, I think I had a bit of and I don't know why, because, my dad was with the United Nations and he was assigned to, various hotspots around the world. And occasionally we would go with him. We were in he was the chief accountant for the peacekeeping force in Cypress, for a few years. He was the chief accountant for the Economic Commission for Africa and Ethiopia during the revolution. So there were some like sketchy, hairy situations where we were overseas. But for some reason, I always had like a rosy view of the world, that people were good and things, even though I wasn't really seeing a lot of evidence of that. I was lucky I had good parents, and I just expected the world would keep being good, and then, as you get older, you're like, yeah, that's a lot of that's up to you, and then again, a lot of it is not, things happen that are
part of it's chance.
Yeah. Beyond your control. And you have to learn how to live with that. But yeah.
How did you decide which school to attend for law school?
So, at the time, and I think it's probably still true, there were a handful of like, sort of what would be considered like powerhouse British universities. And I knew that this was the path I wanted to take. And again, my dad had figured out some of that for me because he was working at the UN. He's like, if you get this qualification, then you can take this exam and then you can do this. And I think somewhere in the back of his head, Guyana was a British colony until the 60s. So I think he always had the sense that maybe we would all move back there. And, like if you're a British barrister, you can practice law in Guyana. And, he wanted to open a library with his brother and all this kind of stuff. Which never happened. But he felt like the British bar was like, I don't know if it's in his mind the only, but certainly a very legitimate qualification. And he said, like, this is your path to get that, So we had decided that I would be going to England for law school. Also, my parents were at the time British residents. They met when they were studying in England in the 60s. So I was also a British resident through birth. So I was entitled to the fee schedule for people who were British residents as opposed to foreign students, which was much more expensive.
Yeah, citizenship,
right,
and all that stuff, residency.
Yeah. So I was entitled to attend school as if I was British.
Yeah.
And it was a lot cheaper. So that had a lot to do with it too. Like the cost of school in the States even then was really, really high. And in England, they actually provided students with like subsidized housing, and the course fees were very low if you're a resident and that sort of thing. So we just looked at what were the kind of like considered the better law faculties at British universities at the time, and Manchester University, or University of Manchester, was up there in the top 5 or 6, I guess. There was like Oxford, Cambridge, Manchester, London. Oh, there's a few, and I got into all the ones I applied to, but I remember, again, I was very fortunate. My dad was able to help me with a lot of this, and we had gone when I was considering this to England. We have relatives over there. My dad's brother lived in England his whole life till he died, and all my cousins are over there, so we visit frequently. And we went around to some different universities, and my my dad had called around, like, my son is considering, taking the full IB and applying to university. Is there anyone who could show him around or whatever? And I remember Manchester took us very seriously. Like, like one of the deans of the faculty met with us, and I don't think she realized that I was 15. You know what I mean? Like because if this is not going to be a possibility, then I won't start it. You know what I mean?
Completely agree.
Right. So he's like, look, let's go see. If you're going to stand there crying and poop your pants, like, we won't do it. You know what I mean?
Yep.
But she met with me, and she actually gave me like a little written test, like some comprehension, paragraph, analyze it, that sort of thing. And I took it, and she was really happy with the results. And she said, look, if you get your full IB, we'll offer you a place here, kind of thing, And I just liked it. The campus was great. And it had a really cool music scene, Manchester, at the time. Like, sort of like the British wave was like in full swing in the late 80s, so like General Public and English Beat and the Smiths and all that sort of thing. Like, it was all happening, and Manchester was like a big part of that. I didn't tell it to my dad, but it was like, yeah, that would be cool. Like, like I'd heard about like the Hacienda is a nightclub, and like there's movies made about it and stuff, and it was like in the neighborhood, and used to go there all the time. And I ended up bouncing nightclubs, when I was over, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I applied to a few, but when I got into Manchester, I thought, I think I want to go there. And yeah, so that's why I went there.
Did you consider staying in England and practicing as a barrister?
Not really. I could have. I was encouraged to by friends and contemporaries and teachers. But I always, I thought perhaps I would go back to New York, take the bar, and then maybe I would come back. I was open-minded about it. I got my degree at 20, passed the British bar at 21. So I was like, we'll kind of see, and I was very, very lucky. I had like no debt, so it was just like, again, it kind of like you approach the world with like, hey, everything's great. Like things just keep happening and working out, very quickly I learned that was not going to be the case forever. You know what I mean? But at that time, I was like, yeah, let's just see what happens. Things tend to work out, and then, I guess I earned the next 20 years of things being really difficult,
Sure. You were due.
Yeah. It's like, all right.
You were such an anomaly.
Yeah.
Very, very neat.
Yeah. So like, here's a whole bunch of shit that you're going to, the things that I could handle, I handled. And, so I always had this attitude of like, let's just try our best.
Describe, you're already barrister. Describe, you ultimately, is it considered challenging the U.S. bar, right? The New York
bar, I think people consider to be one of the harder bars to pass in
How did
the
you
United
prepare
States.
for that?
I took a bar review course, Bar Brie. I don't know if it's still around. I think it is. And there were like, it just so happened to be like a class starting of people preparing for the bar. I think it was 3 months of like intense 8-hour-a-day preparation for the bar. So it was a lot of like recent law school graduates, as well as myself studying for the bar. And, there was like I think we were using St. John's University as like a campus that Bar Brie had rented out space for us. And we could use that law library. And it was like a group of like 12 of us. We became pretty close after 3 months of 8 hours a day, became good friends. Some of them are still my friends. And I think it was a question of keeping the momentum going. I had just been admitted to the British bar, and I felt like if I took time off, I might not get the wheels back in motion. So just like keep going, got some momentum.
It worked out.
Yeah. So like that worked out. Like, people, I remember people saying, oh, it's really great, if you can pass the New York bar the first time. A lot of people don't. And I'm like, really? Well, if I didn't pass the first time, I think I'm just gonna like go do something else because it is a lot of work, And I think at 21, I felt like I could go do something else. I didn't want to disappoint my parents, but
You have plenty of time.
I thought so. So yeah, I mean, luckily I did pass the first time. So and then I got a job with a firm in the States, and then after about a year of that, I went out on my own with my partner. So and then we spent like 20 years litigating in New York.
Unbelievable. So you had a very unique childhood. You lived all over the place. Describe some places that you lived growing up.
So first 6 years we were in New York City because my dad was assigned to the UN headquarters building in Manhattan, and we had when I was born, they lived in an apartment complex in Queens, and then when I think I was about 2, they bought a house in Queens, a little like semi-detached, like Archie Bunker house, row house, and my dad always felt like he would be going back and forth to missions and that sort of thing. So I was there till I was 6. My brother was born when I was 6. And I think when he was a few weeks old, my dad was assigned to the Ethiopia posting, Addis Ababa. So we went there, and my brother might have been 4 or 5 weeks old, and I think I was 6. We were there till I was about 9. Then we came back to New York for a year or 2. And then he was posted to Cypress, for the peacekeeping force in Cyprus. And we went there for like 3 years. And then came back. And then at that point, I was planning on just finishing out like high school, in one place. So I was at the UN school, and I just stayed there. I mean, again, I don't think I realized how lucky I was. If UN employees had reduced tuition, so I was able to go to this sort of fairly elite private school, for much cheaper than what other people were paying because of my dad's job. So, and there were quite a lot of UN personnel kids in that school, but there were also lots of just like people who had the means,
Very neat.
Yeah.
What were some favorite memories you have from either Ethiopia or living in Cyprus?
There are a lot of memories. I don't know about favorite. There are some things that really stand out. We were in Ethiopia at a very difficult time in that country's development, and it wasn't lost on us even as children. I was held at gunpoint by rebels when I was 7. And they were killing people. They were killing diplomats and UN personnel and stuff like that, and the various factions. And they had a military coup. And there was always this question of like, are we gonna, are they gonna pull people out or whatever? I remember I went to an American school there, the American Community School, and it was mostly like at the time Ethiopia had an alliance with the United States, and then when the government changed, name of Mengistu took power, and he was effectively a dictator. He threw out the Americans and brought in the Chinese and the Russians. And I remember like when that happened, like all my friends all of a sudden weren't in school on Monday. They were given like a weekend to pack your stuff and go. So like, my friends who were from the States and their parents worked at the embassy, and it was hairy for them too. A lot of them were made to pack up at gunpoint, and were sort of like airlifted out of there. And, but we stayed for another year or so. Like UN personnel stayed on for another year or so after that. I never thought it was unsafe, and, something my parents had a way of making everything feel normal. It's like, there's like mercenaries and, like rebels, barefoot rebels running around with guns, and they're like, yeah, you're fine, just go to school, and years later, I understand, the amount of stress they were under, like making sure that we were alive, and the level of organization it required for UN personnel to be able to function, but also like keep your kids, safe and not afraid. So I saw a lot of things that maybe children shouldn't see, right? I saw my first execution when I was 6. There were, I remember they have monsoons in Ethiopia. So like sometimes they would do the executions on a hill, and like you could see, like where the building we lived at the time, like people would go up to the roof of the building and like watch, and if it rained, then the blood would wash down, it was like, I never really had nightmares about any of that sort of thing. This is what it was, I was 7 years old, 6 years old, 8 years old, you just saw stuff. I don't even think my parents knew that at the time that I had seen that stuff, because I wasn't supposed to go up on the roof, with everybody else. But I also had some really great times. Like I had a lot of fun, in Ethiopia. Like I had great friends, and we did what kids do. You play, and my parents have some 8mm footage that they had taken of us as kids, in Ethiopia, and it looked like it was just fun. Like we're riding our bikes and playing with all the kids.
Normal.
Yeah, and we lived in a UN compound for a couple of the years. Like a big wall around it, armed guards, and like inside the compound were like, I think 15 or 16 houses, and they were all different, like UN and UNDP personnel, like in that compound, and they had a big like circular like play, like I call it a play area. It was like communal grass area where we all played, and you could ride your bikes around. Like it was like, that's what we did. It was like, it looked like a regular upbringing to me. Even when I look back at like some of the old movies, it looked like we were just like having fun. There's movies of birthday parties and all that stuff. It was like normal. There's some memories where like you kind of have to think, oh yeah, that probably wasn't good. We had they used to call them mamitas, which was because Ethiopia had, it's a matter of some debate, but like they had been quote unquote conquered by Italy, like in the 30s, right? So, although like a lot of Ethiopians don't like to think of it that way, there's always, but there was a heavily Italian influence in Ethiopia. It was really weird. Like if you went to an Ethiopian restaurant, they served lasagna and spaghetti along with Ethiopian food. And a lot of like, so the names that like they gave for like the servants, like mamita, that's your mamita. She's going to be looking after the kids and helping in the house. And like my parents come from a very poor background. So, like class-wise, they come from servants, right? My parents were indentured laborers and slaves, right? So like they told my mom, okay, this is going to be your servant. She's like, I don't want, So she basically adopted her, and
How old were they?
she was like 18 or 19, and like they told us, okay, these are going to be the servant quarters. And my mom's like, no, she's going to live with us if she's going to be here, and she's going to eat with us, and like it, like she would look after my little brother because he was a baby, help my mom with that. But my mom did all the housekeeping and stuff, So it's like they just gave us like a big sister for a few years. So my mother tried to adopt her and her family, and it was really hard. Couldn't get them out. But her brother was killed while we were there. He was 17, and I remember like the conversations. When she came to. She would go home for the weekends, and she would come back and tell my mom in the kitchen how like her brother had gone missing, and then finally, they found out he had been killed by the government. So like a lot of stuff that my parents kind of kept from us the details, but like trying to get her out and not being able to was something my mother always regretted, and stayed in touch, as far as I know, she did well. She's okay, but, these are considerations that, most children don't have. Right. And then we went to Cypress. The peacekeeping force was there at a time of peace. Right. So, you were technically on the buffer zone between the Greeks and the Turks, and control of the island was disputed, or portions of it. But, you didn't really know it because it was like being in paradise, like living in Cyprus. There's beaches and great food. And,
How old were you at that time?
So it'd be like 10, 11, and 12, and again, take your bike and ride, that's what you did, and
those are some of the best childhood years, right?
Yeah. So
you're old enough to do some stuff, right?
Sure. Yeah. I just felt like we had like really fun childhoods,
Very, very cool.
Yeah. I mean, I think one thing that I used to get annoyed at when we would go on these long missions was I couldn't get cartoons, like Saturday morning cartoons.
Bummer.
Yeah. There's no Saturday morning cartoons in Ethiopia and Cyprus, So I was like, there's no TV, there would be like a nightly news broadcast. In Ethiopia, it'd be like propaganda from like 8 to 9 in Ethiopian, or the language is Amharic. And in Cyprus, like they would have their own shows, but they were always in Greek, and that was it.
Remarkable.
Yeah.
So your first powerlifting meet was in 1987.
Yeah.
What inspired you to start powerlifting?
So again, like overconfidence, right? Like, and it's like fluke. There was a gym. I had started working out when I was in New York in high school, 14, 15, 16. I was, like I had joined a gym. I think we had gotten a free membership to Queens Health and Nautilus. And they were like basically giving everybody a free membership to come in. And then, but like we actually took the card and came in. My dad was like, yeah, if you want to like work out, whatever. So he came to the first workout with me to make sure that everybody was kind of on the up and up. And then he was like, okay, this looks cool. Like you can ride your bike here and work. So I was working out since I was 14. And I met a lot of really interesting characters. This is Queens in the mid 80s. Right. And it's like, there's people that I met there that I later understood were famous, but not in a good way, So
infamous.
Yeah. So I'm like, oh, that like for real, Paulie, right? Oh wow, like oh Phil, oh okay, and but they were my friends,
Yeah.
and it's kind of like I didn't really like. Again, people had this way of like taking me under their wing. I don't know why, and I remember like for a certain period of time, like nobody ever bothered me, like other kids were like, oh, I got mugged on the way here. I'm like, I didn't, like, and, if I started working there, they needed somebody to deliver flyers. And, so I said, yeah, you ride around in parking lots and put flyers on cars for the gym. I said, sure. So I had my little BMX and I would ride around and deliver flyers. And the other couple of kids that they had do that would just take all the flyers and put them in the garbage and then come back in 2 hours for a few dollars. And so they started like following them. And I was the only one who was actually putting the flyers on the cars. Like that they told me that like after a week, like, yeah, we followed you a couple times and you were the only one who was taking the flyers, putting them on the cars, and then coming back because you were finished, And I was like, oh, okay. So then they were like, and then a job came up as a trainer. I was 16. And they're like, well, we just won't tell anybody that you're 16, but we'll make you a trainer. And, so I trained people like since I was like 16 years old, 15 really. I always, like I said, looked a little older and I had been working out. And so I got a job there as a trainer in the afternoons after school and on the weekend. So I'd always been fairly strong and working out. And I had like good guidance from the guys at the gym. So when I went to university, I just started training at the local university gym, campus facility. And I noticed that on the wall, they had like records and photographs of powerlifters on the wall. But I didn't think much of it. And they had like a case with like awards and names and stuff. And one day I was deadlifting, probably horrifically, right? And this old man came up to me and he's like, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Oh, I'm deadlifting." He's like, "Why?" I said, "I'm a powerlifter." Of course, I had,
Mm-hmm.
never even seen a powerlifting meet, right? But like, that's what you say when you're 17 and stupid, right? And he's like, "Really? You don't look like a powerlifter." And I was crushed, and but then he's, in his like crusty way, he's like, "If you really want to train, come here Monday at 4." And I was like, "Fuck's he talking to?" You know what I mean? Like, it's an old man with a pot belly, and he had long hair and a beard, looked like a retired hippie, But for some reason, I showed up Monday at 4, and the place was locked up. And I looked in the window, and he was there, and he waved. And they opened the door for me, and I came in. It was Jim Caniff, and he was the British coach of the British IPF junior team, and they just happened to work out of the local gym because he was a teacher locally, and we had quite a few students at Manchester who were on the British team and were really good lifters for some reason, just like randomly. And so like my first experience with powerlifting was like I joined the IPF junior world team for Britain. Like basically, I mean, I wasn't on the team, but they were training there, right? So guys who had been like IPF, like silver and gold medalists were there, bronze, like high ranked powerlifters, really, really top level athletes, guys I had only read about in magazines. I'm like, "Oh, that's Nigel Pitcheathley, like he got silver in the open men's IPF worlds, like badasses, and they were just nice to me. Like you were talking about this piano, Nigel was a concert pianist. That was his gig. But, the guy had like a 2,000 pound total in the 80s. You know what I mean?
Insane.
Right. And he was a piano teacher, but like, and he had studied at University of Manchester and was living around there, and that's where he trained. And like there was a guy, Dean Padley, Laurie Mentesh, and there's a few other guys who were like well-known powerlifters. And again, they just kind of took me under their wing. I was like, "All right, like this is how you do this, and you're gonna not do that anymore. You're gonna do this," and and then Jim would like write out my workouts for me, like, "You're gonna do this." I'm like, "All right." And then he's like, "Yeah, and you're gonna do a meet in 2 weeks." And I was like, "Oh, okay." Right? Like they were just like, if you're serious, you're serious. If you're not, you're not, and that's it. And I remember like because I really just started at university there, like a couple of months before that, and my like friends at university like, "What are you doing? That's crazy!" Like
Yeah, law student doing
why are you
powerlifting.
doing that? I was like, "Oh, I've always worked out. I like it and whatever." And so I was immediately introduced to a world of like strength athletes, men and women. We had some of the, and at the time, the IPF was, the British affiliate was called BALA, British Amateur Weightlifting Association. And it was the governing body for Olympic lifting and powerlifting. So we had quite a few Olympic lifters that would train there too. I never dabbled in that. It looked really complicated to me, but
Agreed.
yeah, but there were some good Olympic lifters, that competed, that trained there also. And some of the top women in England trained there. So, I always trained with like strong women and strong men, and they were always really nice to me for some reason. And, but in that group, were quite a few locals, they weren't affiliated with the university at all. They were just powerlifters who trained with Jim and the team. And a couple of them were bouncers, and so I would then run into them out when I was out hanging out. And now all of a sudden I was getting in at places where I didn't have to line up anymore. You know, like you'd be back on the line, like you'd be 100 people deep on the line and they'd see you and they'd call you forward. So now I'm like a celebrity with my friends. Like they're like, how many people you got with you? I'm like, I got 3 kids. I'm like, all right, come on, you know, and like, and then eventually like I started you know, so it's like, it just became my social circle, you know, and like, I was like immediately elevated to cool status, you know, like for no reason, you know, and you know, and there's a lot of cred, you know, like if you're on a long line for a crowded nightclub that everybody's trying to get into and the bouncer sees you and calls you over and lets you get in with a couple of friends, all of a sudden you're like, who's that guy, you know? And certainly never understood like what that looked like to other people. I was like, oh, that's neat, you know, he's a friend of mine from the gym, you know. Like
So innocent.
yeah, like
right?
that's cool, you know.
Yeah.
And then they would check on me like every like hour or so. You guys all right? You know, like all right, let me know. You know, anybody gives you a hard time, let me know. Like you guys all right? You know, like if your friend was drinking, your friend's drinking, like you know, make sure you get him home okay and this kind of thing. I was like, all right, you know. It was cool. Like I just kept stumbling into like cool situations, you know, and so that's how I got started in powerlifting. And you know, and it's one of the people, you know, even now, I've never charged for coaching the powerlifting team that I coach. Over the years, I have taken 1 or 2 private clients, and I just took something nominal to cover gas or whatever. You know, I'm a lawyer; I don't coach for a living, right? But extremely rare. Molly coaches a group of like spellers, you know, autistic lifters on a one-to-one basis, but you know, I don't. But I never charged for it. And people, I was like, well, you know, like, how does this work? Like you create, like, we do well, not for nothing. Like I produced national and world champions, right? From like scratch. And like you do this for free. And I'm like, I had never paid a coach in my life. So didn't seem fair to me. Like, you know, I started training with like people on the British IPF team for free at the beginning of my powerlifting career, and they never wanted a dime from me, you know? And so why would I charge anybody for that? Like they gave me that knowledge for free. And then when I came back to the States, I was training at, this is the source of like hundreds of hours of stories, but I was training at Ferrigno's in Queens at 164th Street. We lived on 166th. And the characters, holy crap, you know, like, and the fist fights, and it's Ferrigno's gym in the 80s, right? Like in Queens on 164th Street. You can only imagine.
I can only imagine.
Yeah. And my brother and I trained there, and he was then 14, and I was like, you know, 20 at that time when we came back, right? 2021. And then I wanted to do more powerlifting again. And I was looking there were some lifters at Ferrigno's that competed in powerlifting, but, you know, I was reading Powerlifting USA, you know, regularly, and it doesn't exist anymore, and there was no internet, right? So you didn't really know, like but in Powerlifting USA, there was a series of articles periodically by Ken Leisner, who was one of like, I think like one of the editors or whatever. And he wrote for Powerlifting USA and is a fairly well-known strength coach. And it turns out he had a gym on Long Island. So I went out there with my brother one day, just like, hey, I heard you coach powerlifting. I read your articles. And he actually put me through a workout there and then. I showed up after work. I was in a full suit, tie, no gear. My little brother, teenager from Queens, just kind of like walk in, like, hey, what's going on? And Ken was like, yeah, you know, like, let's see what you got, kind of thing. And I'm like, oh, I didn't bring my gear. And he said, well, if you're not serious, you know. And I was like, you know. So took off my jacket and tie, took off my shirt, had my dress pants on, dress shoes, and I had like a white t-shirt on underneath. And we started deadlifting, and I split my pants, you know, and he was apparently happy with what he saw. And he's like, yeah, you guys can train here, you know. And I didn't pay a gym membership, and the gym membership was expensive. And, my brother didn't pay a gym membership, and we just the team trains this time, and this time, show up. So we did, and was there for years, and I never paid him. I never paid for a gym membership. My brother never paid. Other people were paying, at the time, it was a very expensive gym, right? It was Iron Island Gym. It's a pretty famous gym. And Ken was a chiropractor by trade. And he had his practice running out of there also, and he had the gym. And he coached, he was good friends with Lyle Alzado from the Jets, and he coached a bunch of well-known strength athletes and football players, and there were NFL guys in there all the time and this kind of thing, a couple of wrestlers. And he never charged me. So my entire career from 87 to the mid 90s, I didn't even know you're supposed to pay a coach or pay a gym membership, right? I know I had, at Ferrigno's, they just, because we were neighborhood kids, they're yeah, it's $10 a month or whatever, everybody to train every $10 a month. But only later did I find out that meet entries cost money, memberships to federations cost money, gym memberships cost money, coaches I didn't know any of that because everybody was doing it for me for free. So I figured well, I have to pay that forward, with the kids that I coach. I say kids, some of them are, as in their 30s, whatever now. They've been with me a long time, yeah. But yeah, and it comes to find out Jim had been paying and Ken too. They if they sign me up for a meet, they would pay for it. And they would take care of my gym members. Of course, it wasn't for them. It was not that expensive. I mean, a meet entry in England at the time was what, 5 or 10 pounds, which would have been $15 or $20 or something. And now that's $150 to do a meet, here. But it was the adults who had jobs would just chip in for the kids, and we didn't even know. They would just pick you up. Okay, the meet's on Saturday. We'll be outside your student housing apartment, at 7 a.m. Be ready. And we just go, and, I just had great mentors, and I'm really grateful for that,
I think we talked about in the beginning, I want to use the word optimistic, but you look for the best in people.
Mm-hmm.
And we described that earlier. And you're always going to be open-minded that people are truthful, people are honest, and they have the best intentions.
Right.
And I think people saw that purity in you, and that's why these doors continue to open. And it's magnetic. People want to be around people like you.
I don't know. I mean, you might know better than me. I mean, you know me for a long time, but I've been around people that are around me a lot, I don't really know what precedes what, but this sort of sense of optimism, even in the face of shitty things happening over and over and over again, I don't know how else to be,
I'm very similar.
Right. I just don't know how else to be. And I guess that's, if I ever had a gift, that was it, and I remember for a long time in my career, I would tell people, oh, so what's going on this week? Oh, I'm on trial for this case. It's a, whatever, sort of robbery, and this is what happened. And then I looked at the table and people are, but this is just what I did. Right. And I'm oh, that you find that interesting? Well, let me tell you something else. And then I would tell them about what had happened and the case and what the cop said and this kind of stuff. Oh my God, you should write a book. I'm that was just Monday to Friday. I don't know,
You can imagine firefighting.
Yeah.
I'd come at the gym Sunday mornings. Oh, how was your day yesterday? Oh man, I had a 3-car MVA. This thing happened. This person had a heart attack. I got 47 minutes of sleep.
Yeah.
This person was shot. And I'm how many chains do we have on squat?
Yeah.
And they're just
what? Yeah.
And I'm yeah, I'm just kind of want to take a nap. So let's get this done and
right.
I'll go home. Right?
Yeah.
That's it.
So, yeah. It's the same thing. It's you just get things done because they have to get done. And there have to be some people who just get things done.
Very true.
And so I don't know what it's like. I've been around people who are not like that.
Sure.
And it's draining, right? But Yeah, I think that is something that I had, like a sense of like, well, things will probably get better. And also not learning from bad experiences in the way that most people would. Like, well, I'm never doing that again. Like I never really said that to myself, like unless it was obviously something I did stupid,
Sure.
But like if I trusted somebody and they turned out not to be that person, doesn't mean I'm not going to trust the next person.
Proof of their character,
Yeah,
not yours. Yeah.
Exactly.
So I've known you a long time,
Mhm.
fairly long time. You've been competing in powerlifting over 37 years.
Mhm.
I feel it personally extremely important to share stories like your own. Today's powerlifting, it's about dots and rankings and the who's who. More than half of your competitions are not even public record on
Yeah.
openpowerlifting.org.
Yeah, probably 80% of them. Like, it's funny. I was talking to Dave Tate about that. I went to one of his underground strength seminars. One of my lifters was an elite FTS lifter, and she was able to bring her coach. So I was like, oh, I went and had I had known him from back in the day, a long time ago. So we were talking a little bit about that, and like guys from that generation don't exist in the digital world, like, so, I was talking to actually Ed Cohn a little bit about that. Like Cohn, along with Tony Conyers and, Steve Goggins, considered the greatest powerlifters of all time. And a lot of his meets aren't recorded, and Steve too, Tony. Now people will go and try and find those names and put that data in because of who they are. And that's important. I was mediocre. So it was like, it wasn't like that big of a deal. I remember once we were on Facebook. I'm not on Facebook anymore, but like a couple of years ago, when Ken Leishner died, and so people who used to train with him, were talking about him online a lot and stuff, and we were sharing stories, and one of the women that I lifted with in the early '90s, she had found a copy of the roster for, I think, APF, I want to say states or nationals, like in the early '90s. And it was typewritten, right? I think Ken and his business partner, Ralph Rayola, who also passed, also a great guy, were involved in the APF in the beginning. I think Ernie France owned it, but like there were affiliates. And I think they had been involved with like the New York branch of it at that time. So Ken ran a lot of meets as a meet director, and typewritten, typewriter, pull the paper out. And if anybody kept that piece of paper somewhere, then you would have the results of who did what. And if they didn't, well, you got your pictures and your trophy, like nobody cared. It's powerlifting, right? There was no coverage. There's no press. It was powerlifting in the 80s and 90s. It was like you did a meet in like a rec center or, a high school auditorium. And, the productions that we have now and the data and the ability to talk, like, wow, it's great. But like, we didn't have any of that, But you knew people by reputation. I used to hear people talking about me and I was sitting next to them, right?
I've done that at comps,
Yeah.
at meets,
Yeah.
looking at the roster. They're like, oh, what's going on? I'm like, this guy's opening.
Yeah, look,
this guy's good.
Yeah.
He's like, oh, who is him? I'm like, oh, it's John so-and-so. And they're like,
that's
him
me.
there.
Yeah.
I'm like,
wow,
good openers.
Yeah.
I want to see, I look forward to it.
Yeah.
It's funny.
It's funny. So like, that was cool in the sense that like you could be sitting with your, I never really had like idols, but sitting with people you admired and respected and didn't even know it, and they were regular guys. They weren't rich. They weren't famous. They had day jobs. They were teachers and laborers and whatever else it was,
Yeah.
And firefighters and cops and whatever. And oh, he happens to be a world champion powerlifter too. I was like, oh, and nobody cares. You know what I mean? Like his wife doesn't even come to the meets, like, right.
I don't talk about it. We had the conversation before this one.
Yeah.
I told this to you privately. I'm going to tell you now. You're both a legend and a myth in the sport. You described yourself as not very good. However, for everyone listening, I have some of your numbers. As a raw lifter, you squatted 770, you benched 501, you deadlifted 728. as an equipped lifter, squatted 955, you benched 705, and you deadlifted 755.
Mm-hmm.
So many people know about you. Very few know accurate information about you, as I learned, right? So despite the internet not being aware of your many feats, you did attempt 1,000-pound squat.
Yeah.
Tell me about that experience.
Well, I didn't get it, right? So I think that's important. Because sometimes there's just that white whale that gets away. I took it twice. I think once at Southern States, APF Southern States, and I can't remember the other meet. You're talking about over a decade ago, right? But I think it works out to 1,003, the kilo conversion.
Yep.
So Tony was there, James Jake, a few of the guys that I was training with at the time in Tampa, and yeah, I took 1,003 on a third and got called on depth. I never really ever got crushed, with stuff. Like I would come up with it, but it might not be deep enough. And I got called on depth 2-1. And I think that time I was okay with it. Like, yeah, it was close. And my teammates were like, yeah, it was pretty close. Like, it could go either way. Like, all right. I took it again about a year later, and I was sure I was deep enough. You know what I mean? Like teammates, other lifters were like, yeah, you got robbed, and that happens. That's a lesson, like, and then, like I remember like one of the referees saying, oh, you'll get it next time. That was really good, and I'm like, oh, thanks. But in my head, I'm thinking, I'm 44 years old at the time, 45. I'm not, I'm 55 now. I'm like, I'm not putting 1,003 pounds on my back again. That was it. Like now I was coming up at a time where there were just absolute monsters in the sport, like just some of the greatest athletes that people have never heard of, and a 1,000-pound squat wasn't uncommon, right? Like at that time, certainly in equipped lifting. And, one of my very good friend, one of my best friends and training partners is John Bernor, squatted over 1,100 pounds in competition. Steve Goggins is the first person, he's a good friend of mine, to squat 1,100 pounds in competition. He did it at 242 when people were 350 pounds couldn't do it,
Unbelievable.
Yeah, I mean, these are, so like, to me, those are the good powerlifters, right? Like, I have the honor of missing that number. Like
you squatted 955.
Yeah, but again, it didn't seem like that much compared to what was going on around the time. You had like your Greg Penoras and just monsters who were so good. Brajaleski and these a lot of these West Side guys. Everybody could squat 1,000 pounds. So. Yeah, it was one that got away, but honestly, I think like lifting has advanced so much that you've got like raw lifters, just, squatting 1,000 and more, just absolutely. I mean, I trained some of them, like, just things that you just wouldn't have thought possible. And I think that's great for the sport. And like, the pool of talent has opened up in such a way that like people who never really knew about powerlifting or wouldn't have thought of it as something to do are now entering the sport. And like, you're getting like, I've got girls who are like, hitting numbers that guys couldn't hit, 20 years ago routinely, and like, like not big girls, 148, 132, 165, just
Incredible.
Incredible.
You've been powerlifting nearly 4 decades. How has that helped you develop as a coach?
I think it's it kind of is what it is. I think I've always been a student of how to absorb and impart information because I never really felt I was very good at anything, but so I had to learn a lot, right? So I remember, again, I think it was Dave Tate. He wrote an article about this, like, okay, you're a 600-pound squatter, which is very good. Like, what do you need to learn to become a 700-pound squatter? And then when you become a 700-pound squatter, what do you need to learn to become an 800-pound squatter? Like, it's about knowledge, right? And like the people who can teach you at every stage shrink, like who can do that, you know? I don't necessarily think that someone has to have done something in order to be able to teach you how to do it. Like, I don't think that like Mickey could beat Rocky, you know what I mean? But in his day, Mickey was a great fighter, right? You know, I mean, I know they're fictional characters, but the same thing, you know,
Sure.
like, you know, so I think you have to have done it to some degree of expertise to teach it. But you know, I used to have kids coming up like, oh, I'm gonna break all your records. I'm like, you will, I'm sure you will, because you know, like why would I do this if I didn't want you to make you better than me? You know, and like with the girls, the sky's the limit. I mean, the record books have been written and rewritten and written and rewritten like all the time. You know, a lot of them.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and it's just like astounding. So kind of like just like to me, it's a privilege to sort of be on the like a witness, you know, to what's going on in terms of like what people can do, you know. But yeah, I think having been a lifter for a long time helps. I took a break from powerlifting for several years where, you know, I wasn't actively lifting and then came back to it. But yeah, experience counts, you know. I'm always vaguely suspicious of people who coach anything that haven't done it at least a fairly high level, you know. And you get these people to set themselves up as, you know, I see it in powerlifting a lot. I've seen it in bodybuilding. I've seen it in life coaching, whatever that is, you know, like, right? Like
Dunning-Kruger effect.
Right.
And what's awesome, you're answering the questions. I don't even have to say anything.
Okay.
Yeah, I should just hand you the notebook. It's true.
Yeah.
And something I want to take away, a couple minutes ago, you just described, I believe you said, you don't know if you're very good at anything besides learning. You're very good at learning.
Well, I'm very good at trying
to
learn, right? Like,
I don't know if I'm very good at anything.
Yeah.
I'm just pretty good at trying to work hard.
Yeah.
It's really just hard work.
Yeah.
I don't know. People ask numbers. I look up to gentlemen like you and all these people you just stated.
Yeah.
I've got an okay squat.
Well, you're a very good lifter. I mean,
but again, when I compare to these elite specimen, you know what I mean? I don't have a 770 squat or a 955 squat. So I'm like, I've got an okay squat, pretty good bench, pretty good deadlift. Because just like you, I'm looking up to these monsters, right?
Yeah, I mean, I like, you know, I don't, for myself, I've never really gotten wrapped up in numbers, and I've had to look up stuff that I did. Sometimes people said, "Oh, yeah, I saw you do this." I'm like, "Really? Oh, shoot!"
I forget my own numbers, and I have a tenth of your.
Well, no,
your
I mean,
meets.
but it's like, you know, just to quickly go back to that story I was telling you about the Iron Island typewritten thing. She posted on Facebook the roster, and it had my name on it as an Iron Island team member and my brother's name on it as and it was like typewritten, and I had forgotten that meet even happened, and that me and my brother did it together, like in 1993 or whatever it was, you know, and it had like the results and like, you know, and I saw some names and I'm like, oh my God, I wonder how he's doing, you know, teammates and stuff like that, you know, but that is gone. That's like, that experience is in the ether, right? Like, it's not digitized anywhere. I mean, now it's on Facebook, a photograph of it, but like there was no centralized repository of information at that time where people are like, oh, today's, you know, like this week, this meet happened. Let's enter those details. Nobody knows, you know? And then, you know, so you see like, oh, that was, you know, I have no idea if any of those squats were deep, right? That's just the number that was given that day by those judges. Right now you have everybody analyzing video and, you know, all kinds of stuff.
Replay and
yeah,
stuff, yeah,
it's different, you know? So yeah, I did have a lot of people that I look up to, you know, and if you had told me that I would be competing with them legitimately when I first started, I would have said, you know, you're crazy, you know, because to me that you know, those people were, you know, just freaks, gods, whatever, you know, and then all of a sudden like they're your friends and like you're lifting with them. One, sometimes you're beating them or like lifting, you know what I mean?
They become mortal.
Yeah. And that's, you know, so they say like, don't meet your idols, you know, I think that's true to a certain extent, but it's also not true. It's sometimes like, they just turn out to be great people, you know? And, you know, like, that gives you hope. Like, well, maybe I could do that then. Like, he seems like a normal enough person, or she seems normal enough. And
Yeah. That's how I started.
yeah.
Right. I meet these people. Oh, he's benching 600 pounds.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Can I watch you work out?
Right.
And I learned 80% of my bench just watching.
Yeah.
I didn't even say anything. I just sat there and watched.
Sure.
Watching Rich Fika bench.
Yeah.
You didn't have to say anything.
No.
I'd be on the other side of the gym. I'd quietly just watch him.
Yeah.
To me, it was like ballet. Because I would just dissect what he's doing.
Yeah.
Why he's doing stuff.
Yeah.
And I learned so much.
Yeah. And, you know, Rich is a good friend of mine, and, you know, one of the most down to earth people you'll meet. Right. And like, you know, I remember one time we were out for dinner. I can't remember if it was after some meet or something. And I think, you know, there were like a handful of well-known lifters at the table, and some guy came over and was like, "Oh, you're big guys, you know." And like, yeah, like, yeah, you guys lift weights? I'm like, yeah. He's like, how much you bench, right? And at a table of like maybe 8 guys who benched over 500 pounds, right? You know, and a couple like Rich who benched over 600 pounds, right? And this guy's like, I think somebody at the table said, "Oh, you know, like, you know, he's a world record holder or whatever." And the guy goes, "Yeah, my friend benches 900 pounds. You know, I know a guy." Which I always say, like, I don't know why you get credit because you know a guy. First of all, that's not true. B, like, it's like, why do I care if you know a guy? You know, I know a guy. Like, everybody asks you, like, how much you bench? Oh, 400 pounds. Like, I know a guy benches 500 pounds. If I said 500, I know a guy benches 600. Okay. Like, I'm not the best person that you currently know. Thank you. You know what I mean? Like, whatever, you know, and of course no one benched 900 pounds. You know what I mean? So like, this guy didn't know, like, unless he knew one of the handful of geared benchers who were benching over 900 pounds, who were all probably people we knew, right?
Yeah, at that time. Not many people.
Right.
Yeah.
So we're like, oh, you know, and everybody, like, we're grown up, so we're like, oh yeah, that's cool, yeah, you know, like, all right, nice to meet you, you know, this kind of thing. And it's like, he said that to a table full of people who happened to, like, there's probably 10 people in the country who could bench over 600 pounds. 4 of them are sitting at this table. Do you know what I mean? At that time, you know, and I wasn't one of them, but raw, right? And Rich was one of them, you know, and he's super knowledgeable. He's super generous. And, you know, it's a privilege. Like, I trained with, I was telling you about John Bernor and Tony Conyers, you know, 2 of the greats. And, you know, it's just a privilege to be around them, you know, and it's like, holy crap, he's doing what? You know? And I remember one time we were training in New York, and we were just training at a basement of a local gym. They gave us a space to put up a monolift and some competition benches, and we just kind of like try to keep the noise and dust to a minimum in the basement, you know. And there were world champions and, you know, sponsored lifters there, and, you know, it was a high quality of lifting. And occasionally, like, regular gym members would wander downstairs to, like, you know, catch a deadlift or whatever it was. I remember, like, one time a couple of, like, I guess they were college kids were watching, and one of them said, "You know, this is not normal, right?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I know, you know." And he says, like, "You guys must be famous or something." And I'm like, in a very small sliver of the athletic world, you know, people know who some of these guys are, you know? And he said, "Oh, well, I guess Michael Jordan has to train somewhere," you know? Which was like that, like, that's a really good point, you know? Like you're watching John Bernor squat. He's probably one of the best people who has ever done that in the world ever, right? And like, you just walk down and he's, you know, talking to you and giving you advice if you want it and that kind of thing. And I get kids like, "Yeah, I guess Michael Jordan's got to train somewhere." And I'm like, yeah, that was how I felt about John and Tony and Rich. You know, like, the best in the world have to train somewhere. Might as well be here, and I might as well train with them. You know, if they want me to, if they let me. You know,
100%.
Yeah. So, and you just learn so much by sort of soaking up all that atmosphere and absorbing that. Yeah.
I only have a couple questions left. Why are you called Pops?
I don't know. It's funny. I was at a meet. Oh, I think it was one of the women's meets in Georgia a couple of years ago. My wife competed, and Taylor and Sarah. They competed and like won everything. But it was one of Barbara's meets that she had put on, and so we stayed. We got an Airbnb for lifters that came up from Tampa, and we stayed there. And then like on the last night when we were like getting ready to go, one of the lifters said to me, "Now I know why they call you Pops." And I was like, "Oh, like." She didn't elaborate, you know what I mean? Like, but I guess like being around for a weekend, I don't know what made her say that, but I guess she hadn't known that before, So whatever that means, like, what is Pops? Like an old knowledgeable guy who you trust,
Have people been calling you that for a long time?
A long time, yeah. It started in Tampa, although a bunch of guys in New York started doing it too. But I think there was a time when I was coaching. This was something that was sort of near and dear to both Tony and John's hearts, was working with underprivileged people. Both of them are pastors. And, we would always let anyone who wanted to train with us. And a lot of times we were coaching and training kids who really didn't have good role models, and we took that seriously. Like, both Tony and John didn't allow cursing, because like somebody has to say no cursing, or you wouldn't know you're not supposed to curse in polite society, and, like the way the men talked about each other and women was civilized, you know what I mean?
Of course.
And it had to be that way. And these kids didn't have anybody telling them that, it's not their fault. And I remember one time in New York, some of the young kids, I say young, they're like 15, 16, 17, which again, that's when I started, right? They were all squatting together. So 3 of them were standing around one of them squatting, and he bailed, and they all jumped backwards instead of grabbing him.
Catching him.
Right? And I raised my voice because I was like, I kind of came running over. Everybody was okay. And then I raised my voice. And with the obvious, like, what are you doing? Like, why do you think you're standing here? What do you? And their faces went white, like I was going to beat them. And I was like, whoa. Like, they were terrified of me at that moment, because big, strong men raise their voice when you're about to get beat in their experience. Right. And a couple of them were black, so the fact that they went white was interesting. But like, you know what I mean? Like,
of course.
Yeah. I was like, taken aback and like legit scared. And I apologize. Like, I'm really sorry. Like, I don't mean to raise my voice. I just want you guys to be safe. It's important to me that you're safe. And like, when you copy the way that we coach and spot, it's not just the way we're standing around. You have to know why you're doing that, why you're there, what you're supposed to do. And I said, I blame myself for not showing you that beforehand. I just assumed when I saw you doing that you knew what you were doing. Why should I assume that? I don't know. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So
then you eventually take on a role of like being responsible for other people's feelings and like their progress. And, in Tampa, there was a group of kids that didn't really have great relationships with their dads. And, a couple of them just started calling me Pops and just stuck,
I didn't know the answer why.
Yeah.
Before I knew you, people would be like, oh, so-and-so, who's that? Like, that's Pops. They're like, who's Pops? I'm like, Pops is Pops. I don't know anything about him. It's
always been. Yeah. So I do not take for granted that I had very good parents. My mom is still alive. My dad passed, but I had really good parents, like on balance, like having been intimately familiar with other people's lives as a criminal defense attorney, and like getting into like what happened to you and like what brought you here and this kind of thing. And seeing how many people did not have good parents as a factor. It's not the only factor, obviously, right? Some did, right? I I'm acutely aware of how lucky I was, right? So it feels like, again, like just like having like really great coaches, you know, it's like the least I can do is to sort of pass that forward or pass it along, you know, a little bit of help and advice, you know. It turns out people really need it. I didn't know, you know.
Unbelievable.
Mm.
I could talk to you for another 2 hours. We'll have to do that another time.
Yeah.
But I have a gift for you.
Yeah.
I didn't tell you that beforehand.
No.
As these come out, more people will realize, especially the guests, that I write all of my notes in Field Notes. They're a really cool company
Okay.
you may be aware of. They're made in the US. They're just a real quality product that I
Mhm.
really want to stand behind, right?
Mhm.
So every guest gets their own Field Notes. This
Oh,
one's
awesome.
smaller. It fits in your pocket.
Okay, cool.
And I find myself physically writing more and more. So as people have been watching, I handwrite every question. And I was telling you before, at this point of recording these interviews, I've written over 2,000 questions,
Oh, wow.
handwritten.
Yeah.
And I feel it's important. I get to really get to know you with note taking and my thoughts and knowing what I want to talk about and explore.
Mm.
And I want to help push that and promote it as well. So I wanted to give you
Oh, well,
that.
thank you very much. No, this is cool. And I'll definitely use it. I like having sort of like a place where I can keep things together. You know, like as lawyers, you have like boxes full of yellow pads.
Yeah.
And every now and then you'll go through one from a couple years ago, like, oh, wow, like these notes I made on this case, you know.
Changes everything.
Changes
I do
everything.
that with interviews.
Mhm.
It's very textile
Yeah.
and it changes. I'm always typing,
Hmm.
but it's different if it's handwritten. And then you notice your handwriting uniquely right away. It's
Mhm.
instinctual. So I have a couple thank yous. I have to thank Christine Carter for letting us use the Leepa-Rattner Art Museum at St. Pete College in Tarpon Springs. They've been more than gracious. They let us use the entire space just for us, uninterrupted.
Yeah,
I
that's
really,
awesome.
really have to thank them. This is my alma mater. I did graduate from St. Pete College. I really want to thank Christine. The final question to every interview, it's the mantra. It's the greatest lesson my dad ever taught me, and it's to never waste a mistake. And it's so important because he didn't tell me never waste your mistake. It
Mhm.
could have been anyone's
Mhm.
mistake. Ones I've learned from him, from you, and anyone else that I've encountered. So the final question is, what is one mistake you have not wasted?
So, yeah, when we were talking, I, I don't know if I'm going to flip this on its side a little bit, but like, um, it's maybe my mistake as well as the mistake of the people that I'll describe. But um, I have a tendency, and you know, Molly and I were, my wife, were trying to figure out if there was a word for this, and we didn't really try very hard because we didn't even, you know, but like, is there a word for this? I don't know. That's, you know, but you know, like how you anthropomorphize animals. So you give them human characteristics, like, so like, oh, your dog, he's, you know, he likes disco, and or like, you know, or he's really happy to see me where I'm wearing this shirt or whatever. Like the dog doesn't care what shirt you're wearing. Like, you know, he's happy to see you because he likes you and you feed him, you know. And like, could you attribute human characteristics to animals, or, you know, oh, she's always sad when it rains, or, you know, like those are human characteristics you're attributing to the animal. You don't know what the animal thinks. Um, I do that with people, right? Like I attribute characteristics to them that it turns out they probably don't have, right? We kind of talked about it a little bit before. Like, you know, if somebody lets me down, I don't hold it against the next person. Was it a mistake to trust them? Was it a mistake to attribute kindness and decency to someone who had less kindness and decency than I thought? Apparently, might be wrong. Maybe it was just me. You know what I mean? So, in the sense that uh, I still do it, right? Like I still think the best of people instinctively. I've learned that sometimes those people will not live up to those things. And that's really my fault because I attributed those characteristics to them. They didn't. You know what I mean? I assumed that they were a certain kind of person, or that everyone is a certain kind of person. And that turns out sometimes to not be the case, right? So that's a mistake. I've learned from that, but what I've learned from it is to kind of keep making it. You know what I mean? Like, okay, it's okay. like sometimes people will surprise me in the other direction. They're much better at something, or much better people, or much kinder or more generous than I thought. And it's like, wow, that's awesome. I'm glad I opened my life to that person, you know? So I guess that would be my answer, is like, you know, careful to attribute characteristics to people that are like coming from your head, not theirs. And then, but if they do turn out not to be what you thought, like, don't let it color the next relationship.
It's an important lesson. You're the best.
All right.
I appreciate it. We have to do this again.
Yes, definitely. I had a good time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
You too.